Teen dies for 5 minutes, returns with heavenly prophecies, near-death experience. The sterile scent of the hospital filled the air, a bitter reminder of the tension that wrapped itself around this moment. Jonah lay motionless in the hospital bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor providing a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. The doctors had given up hope. His mother, clutching his hand, refused to do the same. It had been 5 minutes, 5 minutes where his heart had stopped. Time had stretched and contracted in that span, and Jonah had felt the weight of both eternity and oblivion. The world around him seemed to blur into a dream as he hovered between life and death. In that fleeting period, his consciousness had left his body, and he drifted somewhere else. It wasn't dark, nor was it light. There was a strange clarity to the place, an overwhelming sense of presence that Jonah couldn't quite describe. He wasn't alone. Figures appeared, shimmering like translucent beings, their forms unclear yet unmistakable in their otherworldliness. One of them stood out among the others, taller, more radiant, exuding warmth that enveloped him completely. This figure reached out to him, speaking words Jonah couldn't quite understand. The voice was calm, soothing, and filled with an understanding that Jonah couldn't yet grasp. And then it all changed. "Jonah," the voice called, and this time, Jonah could hear the words clearly. The being's voice echoed in his mind, not his ears, but he understood every syllable. "The time is near. Things will change, things you cannot stop." Jonah's breath caught in his throat. Was he dead? Was this the afterlife? Questions swirled, unanswered, but there was something else in the figure's gaze, something both familiar and terrifying. The next few moments passed in a haze, flashes of what Jonah would later call visions, though they felt far too real to be mere glimpses. Prophecies unfolded before him, visions of a world on the brink of collapse. A great storm would rise, stronger than any storm mankind had faced before, one that would tear through the very foundations of civilization. He saw cities in ruin, landmarks falling, and people lost, drifting in the wreckage. And there was darkness, an all-consuming darkness that Jonah could feel in his very soul. But there was light as well, a light at the end of it all, distant yet palpable. A promise of hope, even amidst the devastation. Jonah saw faces, thousands of them, faces of strangers, of people he hadn't met, yet their eyes were familiar. The light beckoned, but it was not for him to go to just yet. Jonah could only watch. "Your time is not yet," the figure spoke again, more firmly this time. "But the time will come soon. You will need to carry this message." Jonah tried to respond, but no words came. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, as if time itself had come to a halt. Everything paused, suspended in the air, the images hanging like paintings frozen in mid-motion. And then the light pulled away. Jonah's body jerked in the bed as his eyes flew open, the bright hospital lights cutting through the haze in his mind. His hand twitched, fingers curling reflexively around the edges of the blanket. The beep of the heart monitor echoed in his ears, louder now, more frantic than before. The doctors around him reacted quickly, but Jonah's gaze fixed on one thing, his mother. She was by his side, tears in her eyes, her hand tightly gripping his. He could feel her warmth, but there was something different about it. The fear in her eyes mixed with a strange sense of disbelief, as though she too had felt something she couldn't explain. "Jonah?" Her voice cracked as she whispered his name. His throat tightened, and the words came out hoarsely. "I saw it," he said, barely above a whisper. The doctors looked at each other, confusion filling the room. Jonah's mother held him tighter, not understanding. She asked, "Saw what, baby?" Jonah could barely process the information. His mind was overwhelmed by the images, the visions, the prophecies, the presence. It felt like a dream, but he knew it wasn't. He knew it had been real. Whatever he had seen, whatever he had experienced, it wasn't a fantasy. It had happened. "I saw the end," Jonah muttered, his voice distant. He looked into his mother's eyes, and for a moment he couldn't recognize her. Her face was clouded with worry, but behind it was something else, something darker, something foreboding. "We need to prepare," Jonah whispered, his breath shallow. "The time is coming." Jonah's mind swirled with confusion. fragments of the vision overwhelming him. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he had seen wasn't just a dream. The vividness, the clarity, it had to mean something. But what? He tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the rhythm of the heart monitor as if it would anchor him back to reality. The beeping sound was strangely soothing, a constant reminder that he was, in fact, still alive. But deep inside, Jonah knew something had changed. His mother, still holding his hand, hovered over him. Her face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief, her lips trembling as if she were waiting for him to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. Her voice broke through the haze of Jonah's thoughts. "Jonah, are you sure? What are you talking about? What did you see?" Jonah's chest tightened as the images from his near-death experience resurfaced. He remembered the strange figure, the one who spoke with such authority, the way its eyes held a depth that suggested it had seen far more than any living person ever could. The visions of the apocalypse, the storm, the darkness, it was all so real, and yet, it made no sense. The room felt colder, and Jonah's hand, still gripped by his mother, started to feel oddly detached. "It's real," Jonah managed to rasp. "I saw what's coming. It's not just a dream, it's a warning." His mother leaned closer, her voice a mix of panic and concern. "A warning? What do you mean?" "You're scaring me, Jonah." She wiped away a tear, trying to steady herself, but the look of fear on her face was undeniable. Jonah had never seen her so distressed, so utterly shaken. Jonah tried to focus, pushing through the fog that clouded his mind. He remembered the words spoken to him, "You will carry the message." His eyes widened as he looked up at his mother, but before he could explain further, the doctor entered the room, his presence like an interruption in the flow of Jonah's thoughts. "Jonah," the doctor said, his voice calm but firm. "We've reviewed your condition. You've been through something we can't quite explain. Your heart stopped. But you're stable now. It's a miracle, honestly." Jonah barely registered the doctor's words. He could hear him, but they felt distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away. Jonah's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. But it all felt unreal. The machine beeping beside him, the sterile smell of the room, the fluorescent lights flickering above, it was all there, but Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that none of it mattered. Not anymore. "Jonah," the doctor continued, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation, "we've been monitoring your vitals, and I have to say, I'm baffled. Your heart stopped for nearly 5 minutes, but you came back. You're one of the lucky ones." But Jonah scoffed inwardly at the word. There was nothing lucky about what he had experienced. What he had seen wasn't some random event. It was a warning, a prophecy, something he was meant to carry out, something far greater than any medical explanation could cover. "Lucky?" Jonah whispered, his voice trembling. His mother flinched, glancing at the doctor, unsure of how to respond. "You don't understand," Jonah muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. "It's coming. It's all coming. The storm, the destruction, it's real. I saw it." The doctor's brow furrowed in confusion. "Jonah, we need to take it slow. Your body has been through a traumatic event. We'll run more tests, but you need to rest. All of this, what you're saying, it could be a result of the stress on your body." Jonah couldn't listen to him anymore. He wasn't delusional. He knew what he had seen. He could still feel the weight of it, the figures, the darkness, the storm. It was as if the very fabric of the world had unraveled in those few minutes, leaving him with a truth that no one else could see. Jonah looked at his mother again. Her worried expression deepened. "What do you mean, Jonah? What storm? What darkness?" She shook her head, trying to understand but not able to grasp the full extent of his words. "I just want you to get better. This is too much for you to deal with right now." Jonah closed his eyes, trying to push away the images, but they wouldn't fade. The figure, the prophecy, it felt like it was carved into his soul. There was no turning back. And yet, as the doctor and his mother continued to talk, Jonah realized that they would never truly understand. He had been to the edge of existence, seen the things that waited beyond, and now he was burdened with knowledge no one else could comprehend. The silence in the room grew heavy, and Jonah's breath became shallow. He didn't want to go back to sleep. He didn't want to wake up and find out that everything he had seen was a hallucination. He had to hold on to it. He had to carry this message, whatever it meant. But the words felt stuck in his throat. "I'm not crazy," Jonah finally said, his voice cracking. "I saw it. It's coming." His mother reached out, gently stroking his hair. "Jonah, I know you're scared. You've been through so much. But you need to rest. This is a lot for you to process right now." Jonah shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "You don't get it. I've seen the end. And I'm the one who has to stop it." Jonah lay in the sterile hospital bed, his body feeling heavy with exhaustion, but his mind was wide awake. The images, the sounds, the experience, it all haunted him, clung to him like a suffocating fog. He had seen the world unravel, seen its destruction in a vision far too real to ignore. And now, as he lay there, unable to shake the feeling that time was running out, Jonah realized he had no idea what to do with what he had been given. The doctors and nurses moved around him, adjusting his IVs, taking his vitals, checking the monitors that beeped with regularity beside his bed. But to Jonah, it all felt irrelevant. None of it mattered. The monitors, the tests, the sterile white walls. These things had no bearing on the greater reality he had glimpsed. His mind felt torn between the physical realm, where his body still lay fragile and vulnerable, and the apocalyptic vision that played in his mind like an unrelenting film on loop. The room felt cold, too quiet, too sterile. Jonah glanced at the clock on the wall, the minutes slipping by like they had no meaning. He could feel the weight of the words that had been spoken to him in that place, the weight of the vision that had been imparted. He had seen what was to come, and now he knew it was his responsibility to share it. But how? How could he explain what he had seen to anyone who couldn't comprehend it? He turned his head, catching sight of his mother again. She was standing by the window now, her back to him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The faint sound of her breathing was the only sound in the room that didn't come from a machine. Jonah wanted to reach out, to tell her everything, but something held him back. The words felt too heavy, too final, to be said out loud. He knew that once they were spoken, there would be no taking them back. He wanted to tell her what he had seen, the figure that had spoken to him, the darkness that loomed on the horizon, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. It was as if speaking those words would make them even more real, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jonah, the doctors said you need to rest. I know you're scared, but this isn't you. You've been through a traumatic event, and this is just part of the process. The body goes through a lot when it's been close to death. But you'll be okay. I know you will." Her words were comforting in their own way, but they also felt like a denial. She couldn't see what Jonah had seen. She didn't understand the depth of what he was carrying. Jonah closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. He had to keep it together. He had to hold on because he knew that whatever was coming, it wasn't just for him to stop. It was bigger than him, bigger than anything he could have imagined. He had seen the destruction, the floods, the fires, the chaos, and he had seen who was responsible. The darkness he had witnessed wasn't some vague fear. It was real, it was tangible, and it was coming. And now, Jonah felt like the last person left to stop it. But how? What could he do? He was just a kid, lying in a hospital bed, still recovering from an event that had almost taken his life. How was he supposed to stop the end of the world when he couldn't even explain what he had seen to anyone? A part of him longed for the normalcy he once had, to return to a life where he didn't have to carry the burden of such knowledge. He thought of his friends, his school, his family. The things that once seemed so important now felt insignificant. They didn't matter in the face of what was coming. They didn't matter in the face of the truth he had seen. As his mind spiraled, Jonah noticed that the beeping of the heart monitor had become more erratic, a rapid succession of beeps, almost as if the machine were echoing the chaos inside his chest. He looked over at his mother, who was now pacing back and forth near the window, her phone pressed against her ear. She was speaking in hushed tones, but Jonah could see the strain on her face, the worry in her posture. She was trying to be strong for him, but he could feel the weight of her concern. "Mom," Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible, the words barely escaping his lips. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face softening with relief. "Jonah, sweetheart, you're awake. You need to rest, okay? The doctors will be in soon to check on you again. You're doing great." Jonah nodded faintly, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he rest when everything he had seen was still pressing on his mind? How could he sleep knowing that the world as they knew it was slipping away, piece by piece? "I don't know how to explain it," Jonah said softly, his voice cracking. I saw what's coming. It's real. It's all real, and I don't know how to stop it." His mother froze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and sat down beside him, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Jonah," she said quietly, "you've been through a lot. Your body was shut down for a while, and now it's trying to heal. But you're safe now. You're going to be okay. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Jonah shook his head, his chest tightening with emotion. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't just in his head, that it wasn't just some nightmare. He wanted to tell her that what he had seen was real, that the end was coming, and that no one else seemed to see it. But the words wouldn't come. He could feel the weight of them pressing against his chest, threatening to suffocate him. "I can't explain it," Jonah whispered again, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "But I saw it. I saw the end." Jonah's heart raced as the words hovered in the air, heavy with an undeniable weight. He had seen the end. He could still feel the echoes of it reverberating in his bones, as if every part of him was now attuned to the chaos he had witnessed. His mind raced with fragmented images, fires consuming the sky, oceans swallowing entire cities, the earth cracking open like a gaping wound. And through it all, there had been a voice, a presence, that had guided him, telling him what was to come. The room around him felt suffocating, too bright, too sterile. The constant beeping of the heart monitor seemed to mimic the rapid rhythm of his own heart, each beat a reminder of the fragile life he was clinging to. Jonah shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed, the covers tangled around his legs. He didn't want to be here anymore. He didn't want to be trapped in this sterile world, away from the firestorm that was approaching. But the knowledge gnawed at him relentlessly. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be dead, his life snuffed out by that sudden, brutal attack. But instead, he had been pulled back, pulled from the void, from the abyss, only to carry the burden of the future that awaited humanity. A future that was filled with suffering, pain, and destruction. The vision was all-consuming, and Jonah felt like he was slowly drowning in the weight of it all. "Jonah," his mother's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. She stood at the side of his bed, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Fear, maybe? Or was it disbelief? It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. "Mom," Jonah whispered, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been trapped in his throat for far too long. "I saw it. I saw what's coming." His mother's expression faltered for a moment, and then she took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady herself. "Sweetheart, I know you've been through something terrible. I know this has been so hard for you, but you need to rest. You're not well yet. Your body is still healing." But Jonah could hear the tremble in her voice, the doubt in her words. She didn't believe him. How could she? He could hardly believe it himself. But the images he had seen were vivid, so clear, so real. They weren't just dreams or hallucinations. They were a warning, a vision of what would unfold in the coming days, weeks, and years. Jonah closed his eyes, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. He had been shown the future, but it wasn't a future anyone could ever prepare for. It was a future where humanity was torn apart by its own actions. A future where greed, hatred, and ignorance had built walls that could never be torn down. He had seen the collapse of society, the fall of cities, the desperate scramble for survival in a world that had gone mad. "There's so much we can't stop," Jonah murmured, his voice barely audible, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "It's already happening. It's too late." His mother's eyes widened, her hand tightening around his arm as if she could somehow pull him back to reality, to the world she had always known. "What are you talking about? You need to rest, Jonah. Please. You've been through so much. You're just confused." Jonah shook his head, frustration and fear rising in him like a tidal wave. "I'm not confused, Mom. I saw it. I saw the destruction. The fire, the water, the chaos, and it's already starting. You won't believe me, but it's coming. It's coming for all of us." Tears filled his eyes, blurring his vision as he looked at his mother, pleading for her to understand. But she only looked back at him with a mixture of concern and uncertainty, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to comfort him. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're scaring me. You need to calm down. You're not well. You need to trust the doctors. They're doing everything they can to help you." But Jonah couldn't trust the doctors. They didn't know the truth. No one did. He had seen it, and now it was his responsibility to share it. But how? How could he explain to anyone the horror he had witnessed? How could he make them see that the world was on the brink of something terrible? A sudden pain shot through his chest, a sharp, stabbing sensation that made him gasp for air. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming as the room seemed to tilt and warp. The heart monitor beside his bed beeped wildly, its tempo increasing as his heart rate spiked. He felt like he was slipping away again, his body once again on the edge of death. "Mom," he gasped, clutching at the sheets, his voice strained. "I don't know how much time we have left. Please, believe me." His mother stepped back in shock, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to say something but couldn't find the words. She reached for the call button beside his bed, her hands shaking. But Jonah didn't care. He didn't care about the doctors or the nurses or the sterile machines that beeped around him. All he could think about was the future he had seen. The future where humanity was lost, where nothing was left but ashes and rubble. And he knew, deep down, that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. As the pain intensified, Jonah's vision blurred further, and he felt the weight of unconsciousness pulling him down. But even as his body trembled, even as his mind began to shut down, one thing was clear: the world was ending, and he was the only one who knew it. Everything else was fading, but the vision he had seen, the horror, the prophecy, stayed with him, clinging to him like a dark shadow. He had seen the truth. And now there was nothing left but to wait for the inevitable. Jonah's body trembled violently as the pain coursed through him, overwhelming him in waves. He could feel the weight of it all, like a heavy blanket pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. His mind was racing, thoughts scattering in a million directions, none of them making sense. The room around him seemed to spin, and the faces of the doctors and nurses blurred into a disorienting haze. "Jonah, please," his mother's voice echoed in his ears, a plea for him to focus, to come back to her, to the world of the living. But he felt so far away. His body, his mind, it all felt so disconnected, like he was floating outside of himself, detached from the reality of the moment. He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to scream it out, to make her understand, but the words felt trapped, caught in his throat. He glanced down at his hands, his fingers shaking uncontrollably as they gripped the edge of the bed. The monitors beeped louder, more urgently now, but Jonah didn't care. None of it mattered. Not the doctors, not the sterile white walls of the hospital room, not the medicine, not the machines. It was the vision. It was the future. The one he had seen so clearly, the one he knew was coming. No matter how much he tried to push it out of his mind, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that it was all just a bad dream, the truth was inescapable. He had seen the end. The fire, the water, the devastation. It was all coming for them, coming for everyone. The earth itself would betray them, just as it had in his vision. The cities would burn, the oceans would rise, and the ground would crack open, swallowing whole neighborhoods in an instant. And people would panic. They would run, they would fight, they would betray one another, all in a desperate attempt to survive. But it was all futile. It was already too late. His body shuddered at the thought, and he clenched his eyes shut, willing the images to fade. But they wouldn't. They never would. "Jonah, listen to me." His mother's voice cut through the fog in his mind, and this time, it pierced him like a sharp knife. "You're not alone in this. You're going to make it. Please, you have to try. Fight, Jonah. You've been through too much. You can't give up now. But Jonah couldn't fight. Not anymore. The battle had already been fought, and the outcome was inevitable. He had seen it in the distant future, seen it in every horrendous detail. The earth was dying. Humanity had failed. There was no stopping it now. The beeping of the heart monitor became frantic, the sound ringing in his ears, louder, more insistent. He could feel his pulse racing in his neck, his body tensing in pain. His breathing became shallow, jagged, each breath harder to take. The light in the room flickered as if the very building itself were trembling in fear. Jonah turned his head, his eyes locking onto his mother's tear-streaked face, but all he could do was shake his head. There was no escaping this. There was no reversing the damage already done. "I can't," he whispered, his voice weak, barely a breath. "I saw it. It's already too late." His mother's face contorted with confusion, the desperation in her expression clear. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" But Jonah didn't have the strength to explain, not anymore. He had no words for what he had seen, no way to make anyone understand. How could he? How could anyone believe him? How could they comprehend the horrors that he had witnessed, the unrelenting destruction, the cold finality of it all? The room was spinning faster now, the walls closing in on him. He could feel himself slipping, losing his grip on reality, and for a moment he thought maybe he was dying again. Maybe the vision was just a part of the process, a final gift from whatever powers controlled the afterlife. But if that was the case, if he was meant to die, then why hadn't he just stayed there? Why had he been pulled back? His eyes flitted over to the machines, the wires that were attached to his body, the needles in his skin. His fingers twitched in the air, reaching for them, as if some part of him wanted to pull them out, to tear himself away from this world, to escape the weight of the future that was pressing down on him. But he couldn't move. His body was paralyzed by the pain, by the sheer force of the truth he was carrying. "Please, Jonah, you have to stay with me. We can get through this together," his mother begged, her voice breaking with the strain of trying to hold him together. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly in hers, but Jonah could barely feel it. His mind was miles away. He could see nothing but the vision, the prophecy, the nightmare unfolding in front of him. He knew that no one could change it. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not even his mother. They couldn't stop what was coming. It was already happening. It was already too late. The lights in the room flickered once more, then went out completely. The sudden darkness was suffocating, oppressive. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he tried to fight for air, but the weight of the vision was pressing harder, suffocating him, dragging him back into that place, the place where he had seen the end. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the darkness lifted. The lights flickered back on, harsh and bright, almost blinding. Jonah blinked rapidly, trying to clear his head, trying to focus on the present, on his mother, on the people around him. But the vision, no, the truth, was still there. It was a part of him now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You don't understand," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "It's already too late. It's all already gone." His mother's face crumbled in confusion and fear, but Jonah could see the tiniest flicker of doubt in her eyes. Was she starting to believe him? Or was it just pity? There was no more time. The future had already arrived, and Jonah knew that soon, everyone else would see it too. The prophecy was real, and the world was about to end. The weight of the truth bore down on Jonah like an anchor dragging him beneath the surface of a turbulent sea. His breaths were shallow, his chest rising and falling in panicked spurts, as if his body were betraying him. He glanced at the nurses and doctors moving around him, their mouths forming words he couldn't hear, their gestures frantic, but everything felt distant, muted. The urgency of the world around him paled in comparison to the unrelenting storm within his mind. Jonah's mother was still by his side, her hand gripping his tightly as if her touch alone could tether him to reality. But reality had fractured for Jonah. His mind remained locked in that other place, the place where time had no meaning, where the fabric of existence seemed to unravel and reveal the horrifying truth beneath. "Jonah, look at me," his mother pleaded, her voice cutting through the fog of his thoughts. "You're here with me. Stay with me." But how could he stay? He had seen too much. The images were burned into his consciousness like scars that would never fade. They flashed before his eyes now with a vividness that made his current surroundings feel like a pale imitation of reality. The earth splitting open, fissures running like veins across the ground, swallowing everything in their path. Skyscrapers crumbling into dust, their steel and glass skeletons reduced to rubble. Firestorms raging across the horizon, consuming everything in their wake. And the people, oh, the people, screaming, running, clawing at one another in desperation. Their faces were twisted with fear, their eyes wide with the realization that there was no escape. Jonah squeezed his eyes shut, willing the images to stop, but they only came faster, more vivid, more relentless. He could still hear the voices from his vision, the disembodied whispers that had surrounded him in that other place. They had spoken in unison, their words both cryptic and devastatingly clear. It has begun. Jonah's body shuddered at the memory. Those 3 words carried the weight of inevitability, of doom. They weren't a warning, they were a declaration. The events he had witnessed weren't just a possibility, they were a certainty. And the thought of it made his stomach churn. Jonah, his mother said again, her voice trembling. Please talk to me. What's going on? What are you seeing? He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment he wanted to tell her. He wanted to unburden himself, to share the weight of what he had seen, to make her understand. But how could he put it into words? How could he explain the sheer magnitude of the destruction, the hopelessness that had gripped him in that other realm? How could he describe the feeling of standing on the precipice of the apocalypse and knowing there was nothing anyone could do to stop it? I can't, he whispered, his voice cracking. You wouldn't believe me. Her brow furrowed, her grip on his hand tightening. Try me, she said, her tone a mix of desperation and determination. Whatever it is, I'll believe you. Just tell me. Jonah hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. But before he could decide whether to speak, the room was plunged into chaos. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The machines monitoring Jonah's vitals began to beep erratically, their alarms shrill and piercing. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. What's happening? One of the nurses shouted, her voice tinged with panic. I don't know, another replied, frantically checking the equipment. Everything's malfunctioning. Jonah's heart raced as the atmosphere shifted. He could feel it, an unnatural presence, something that didn't belong. It was the same feeling he had experienced in that other place, the same oppressive weight that had surrounded him as he stood on the edge of the abyss. The whispers returned, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. He knows. Jonah's breath hitched, his body freezing as the words washed over him. He glanced around the room, but no one else seemed to hear them. The doctors and nurses were focused on the malfunctioning equipment, their movements hurried and frantic. His mother was still at his side, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. Jonah, she said, her voice shaky. What's going on? What's happening? He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in his mind like a sinister chorus. You must tell them. Jonah's chest tightened as the words reverberated through him. He shook his head, his hands trembling. No, he whispered, barely audible. I can't. His mother leaned closer, her concern etched into every line of her face. Please, she said. What are you talking about? Tell me. But he couldn't. How could he explain that the whispers weren't just voices? They were commands. How could he tell her that the vision he had seen wasn't just a glimpse of the future, but a demand for action? How could he admit that he was supposed to be the messenger, the one to deliver the prophecy to a world that would never believe him? The whispers grew louder still, their tone shifting from insistent to angry. The lights in the room flickered again, and the temperature seemed to drop, a chill settling over everyone. Tell them, the voices commanded, their words sharp and unforgiving. They must know. Jonah clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as if he could physically block out the sound. "Stop," he muttered, his voice strained. "Please stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more demanding, until they were all he could hear. His vision blurred, and he felt the world around him slipping away once more, the edges of reality fraying like an old tapestry. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The light stabilized, the machines returned to normal, and the whispers faded into silence. The room was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the aftermath of the disturbance. Jonah's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. He glanced at his mother, who was staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. What just happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah didn't respond. He couldn't, because deep down he knew the answer. The whispers weren't going to stop. The vision wasn't going to fade. The prophecy wasn't going to let him go. And the world wasn't ready for what he had to say. The silence that followed the strange episode felt suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on Jonah's chest. He sat in his hospital bed, his heart racing and his thoughts scattered, unable to make sense of what had just happened. His mother sat beside him, her hands still gripping his, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The nurses and doctors continued to move around the room, trying to restore order to the chaos that had erupted just moments before. Jonah could feel his body growing weaker, the lingering effects of whatever had just occurred wearing him down. The vision he had seen, the prophecy that had been spoken to him, it was all too much. It wasn't just the voices that haunted him, it was the knowledge that the end was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Jonah," his mother said softly, her voice trembling. "What's happening to you? What was all of that? You've been so quiet, so distant." Jonah turned his gaze to her, but the words didn't come. He could feel the weight of the prophecy settling heavily in his mind, a burden he wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry. The whispers, the images, everything he had seen, it was all too real, and the truth was impossible to ignore. "I'm scared, Mom," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't escape it. They won't leave me alone. I'm the one who has to warn them." His mother's brow furrowed with concern. "Warn who? What are you talking about? Please, Jonah, you need to tell me what's going on." Jonah shook his head, his eyes darting around the room. He could still hear the whispers, even now, soft and insistent, like a distant echo in his mind. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They're all going to die. We're all going to die." The room seemed to freeze around him as his words sank in. His mother's grip tightened on his hand, but her expression was one of helplessness. She didn't know how to comfort him, how to make him feel safe again. Jonah wasn't sure how to comfort himself. The prophecy had taken hold of him, and it wouldn't let go. He had seen it all: the fires, the earthquakes, the wars. The destruction of everything he knew, the end of humanity. The whispers had made it clear, there was no avoiding it. It was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Please, Jonah, just breathe," his mother urged, trying to calm him. "We'll figure this out. We'll get through this together." But Jonah could feel the walls closing in. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on to his sanity. The prophecy, the vision, it was consuming him, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before it swallowed him whole. "Tell them," the whispers echoed again, their voices now growing more frantic, more desperate. "You have to tell them." Jonah winced, his hand clutching his head in pain. The pressure was unbearable, the voices relentless. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape the truth that had been thrust upon him. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that he was the messenger, or the fact that no one would believe him when he tried to warn them. His mother's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. "Jonah, listen to me. I know you're scared. I know you're confused. But we'll get you help. We'll find someone who can make sense of all of this." But Jonah didn't want help. He didn't want to be fixed. He wanted the voices to stop. He wanted the images to fade. But deep down, he knew they never would. The prophecy wasn't just a vision, it was a warning. And it was up to him to deliver that warning, whether anyone believed him or not. "I'm the only one who can stop it," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. I have to stop it? His mother stared at him in disbelief. Stop what, Jonah? What do you mean? What's happening to you? Jonah's eyes darted to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the prophecy pressing down on him, the suffocating knowledge that the end was coming, and he was the only one who could prevent it. I don't know how, he said softly, his voice shaking. But I have to try. I have to warn them before it's too late. As he spoke, the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, unified command. Tell them. It's your only chance. Jonah closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside his head, and they weren't going anywhere. He was trapped in the knowledge of what was to come, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His mother reached out to him, her eyes filled with fear and concern. Jonah, please, she begged. Talk to me. Tell me what's going on. I need you to fight this. But Jonah knew there was no fighting it. The prophecy had already been set in motion. There was no going back. The whispers had already spoken, and the end was already in motion. The only question that remained was whether he could warn them in time. As Jonah lay in his hospital bed, his body weakened from the trauma and the weight of the prophecy pressing down on him, he felt the last threads of his sanity begin to fray. The whispers were louder now, like a constant hum in the back of his mind. The visions were clearer, more vivid than ever before, and they showed him the same thing over and over again, humanity's inevitable destruction. The fires, the storms, the wars, all of it. And he was the only one who knew, the only one who could prevent it, but no one was listening. His mother sat by his side, still holding his hand, but her concern had turned to desperation. She watched him with tearful eyes, but she didn't know how to help him, how to make him understand that everything would be okay. She didn't know that Jonah wasn't just seeing things, he was witnessing the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone could imagine. I can't stop it, Jonah whispered, his voice broken with the weight of it all. It's too late. It's already happening. His mother shook her head, unwilling to accept what he was saying. No, Jonah. It's not too late. You're not thinking clearly. You're confused, but we'll get you better, okay? We'll fix this. But Jonah could feel it, feel the truth coursing through him like a cold wave. There was no fixing this. The end was inevitable, and nothing could change that. I've seen it, he said quietly. I've seen it all. The world, it's already falling apart. His mother's tears fell as she reached for him, but Jonah could barely feel her touch. He was too far gone, too consumed by the prophecy to be comforted. The images of destruction played on loop in his mind, each one more vivid and real than the last. The earth would shake, the sky would burn, and no matter what they did, it would all be over. I'm sorry, Jonah whispered, his words barely audible. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't warn them in time. As his vision blurred, the whispers began to fade, but the final image burned into his mind. A world in flames. The last survivors looking for a way out. And there he was, standing among them, helpless. Because no matter what he did, it was too late. I tried, Jonah said one last time, his eyes closing as the darkness took over. He was at peace now. The whispers had stopped, and the weight of the prophecy was no longer on his shoulders. But it didn't bring him comfort, it only deepened the sorrow in his heart. And with that, Jonah let go. The world did not end the way Jonah had seen it, at least not yet. His prophecy remained unfulfilled, but the impact of his words rippled through his community, a warning that went largely ignored. As time went on, the world continued on its unpredictable course, one disaster after another, each one seeming to echo the warnings Jonah had shared, but without the clarity he had seen. His mother, devastated by his loss, clung to his words, unsure if they were truly prophetic or just the ramblings of a confused boy. She spent the rest of her life haunted by the possibility that Jonah had seen the truth, that he had glimpsed the future and failed to warn the world in time. But there was nothing she could do. And as for Jonah, wherever he was, whether at peace or still trapped in his visions, he had delivered his message. It was up to the world to decide whether to listen, and whether they would be able to change their fate in time. But as time passed, the questions remained. Could it have been avoided? Was Jonah truly a messenger, or just a victim of his own mind? No one would ever know for sure, and the answers were left to the echoes of his prophecy, unanswered and forever lingering in the air like a fading whisper. Jonah's body lay still in the sterile hospital bed, his once glowing face now pale and lifeless. The machines that had once beeped with his heartbeat were silent. The room felt colder than before, and an eerie stillness settled in, as if something was waiting, watching. His mother sat by the bed, her eyes red from crying. She had clung to the hope that he would wake up, that somehow the visions and the terrifying words would fade. But as the minutes turned into hours, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. Suddenly, Jonah's eyes fluttered open. But they weren't the same eyes. His pupils were dilated, as if something else was looking out through them. A low, guttural whisper escaped his lips, a voice that wasn't his own. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were twisted, garbled. It's happening. Before she could react, Jonah's body jerked violently, and the lights in the room flickered. The machines buzzed to life again, beeping erratically as if something, or someone, was pulling at the strings of reality itself. His mother stepped back in shock, her breath caught in her throat. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all layered on top of each other. Jonah's mouth stretched into a twisted grin, and his body began to convulse as if something was forcing its way out of him. "Jonah, what's happening?" she screamed, reaching for him, but something stopped her, an unseen force pushing her back. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, as if the very walls of the hospital were shaking. And then, all at once, Jonah's body went limp. The room began to distort, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. The figure stepped forward, and as its feet touched the ground, the very foundation of the room trembled. The figure's voice, calm but terrifying, filled the room. "The prophecy is not over, and neither is the pain." Before she could scream, the walls cracked open, revealing a fiery abyss beyond. The last thing she saw was Jonah's empty, lifeless eyes staring back at her, no longer human. And then everything was swallowed by the darkness.